"Dad," Jason said with a half-smirk, pushing the plate back across the counter. "Nobody eats meatloaf anymore. It's outdated like your recipes." Rachel chuckled lightly, as if to soften her brother's words, but her agreement hung in the air just the same. "Yeah, Dad, maybe this year we can just do something different." The old kitchen, with its scarred wooden counters and cast-iron pans that had served 1,000 meals, fell silent. Henry Parker didn't answer right away. His hands, calloused and steady from decades of work, wiped the blade of a kitchen knife on a faded towel. His eyes drifted to the photograph pinned on the refrigerator door. Margaret, his late wife, smiling in an apron stained with flour. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of years unspoken. And here, friends, is where our story begins. Welcome to Family Shadows, the place where hidden wounds and quiet acts of justice inside families come to light. If you've ever felt the sting of being unappreciated, or the weight of love unreturned, you will find a piece of yourself here. Before we continue, let me invite you. If these stories speak to you, if you believe that every family has lessons buried in its shadows, then please subscribe to our channel, join our growing circle, and help keep these stories alive. Now, let us turn the page to today's story. They said my cooking was outdated, so I served them the bill for every meal they took for granted. Henry Parker was 60 years old, though some days he felt older. His shoulders carried not just the weight of years, but of countless dinners, packed lunches, birthday cakes, and holiday feasts. His life had been measured not in hours or dollars, but in meals prepared, served, and quietly cleaned up after. He had not always been alone in that kitchen. Once, there was Maggie, Margaret Parker, with her laughter echoing against the pots and pans, flour streaking her cheeks as she scolded him for sneaking a taste before the bread cooled. She was the heart of the meals, he the hands. Together, they had raised Jason and Rachel on stews that warmed the soul, pies that brought neighbors knocking, and Sunday roasts that stretched even the leanest paychecks into abundance. Now, Maggie's apron hung on a hook by the pantry, untouched since the day they lowered her into the ground. Henry never washed it. He couldn't. The faint scent of cinnamon still clung to the fabric, a ghost of her presence that kept the kitchen from falling silent altogether. That evening, as Jason and Rachel sat at the small dining table, Henry had done what he always did. He cooked. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans simmered with onion, the kind of food that had kept them alive when bills piled higher than hope. Jason forked a bite, chewed, and shrugged. It's like stepping back in time. He grinned at his sister. Dad still thinks it's the 70s. Rachel laughed, though softly, as if embarrassed by her own amusement. It's just old-fashioned, Dad. People want something fresher, more, I don't know, modern. Henry listened, his knife moving across the cutting board in measured strokes. He didn't argue. What would be the point? Children rarely saw the hands that fed them. They only saw the plate that appeared in front of them. Inside, though, something bent. Not broke. Henry Parker was too seasoned for breaking, but bent like a beam under pressure. Outside, rain tapped the roof of the old Parker house. Seattle's skies had always been gray, but tonight they seemed to join in the children's verdict. His cooking was no longer wanted. Henry reached for the dish towel, wiping his palms. His gaze fell again on Maggie's photo. They don't remember Maggie, he thought. They don't remember how those outdated recipes kept the lights on, how they filled stomachs when the wallet was empty. But he said nothing aloud. He rarely did. To Henry, the kitchen was more than a room, it was a sanctuary. The worn oak cabinets, the creak in the floorboards by the sink, the heavy skillet blackened by years of use, Each was a chapter in the Parker family story. He remembered Jason as a boy tugging at his sleeve. "More mashed potatoes, Dad." He remembered Rachel sneaking cookie dough when Maggie's back was turned, giggling with flour on her nose. Those memories lived in every pot and pan, and yet to his grown children those same objects were relics of irrelevance. Henry ran a finger along the handle of the cast-iron pan. His father had given it to him when he married Maggie. It had outlived wars, recessions, and family squabbles. It would outlive him, too. But could it outlive the indifference of his own children? Jason leaned back, stretching. "This year we should just cater. Try something modern. Fusion, maybe Thai or sushi. It'll impress people." Rachel nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, Dad, maybe it's time we give you a break. You don't have to cook for us anymore." Henry heard the words, but what reached his heart was the subtext. "We don't want your cooking anymore." He smiled faintly, hiding the wound. "If that's what you'd like." But inside, the hurt was raw. To be told that the very thing you built your life around, the meals that sustained them body and soul, was outdated, was to have your love dismissed as irrelevant. Only one voice cut through the fog. Lily, 10 years old, with Maggie's eyes and Henry's stubborn chin, piped up from the end of the table. "Grandpa, can you still make your apple pie, the one with the sugar on top?" Her innocence pierced the heaviness. Henry's heart softened, though his voice stayed even. "Of course, sweetheart, I can always make apple pie." Jason rolled his eyes. "Pie's fine, Lily, but we're talking about the main dinner." But Henry wasn't listening to Jason anymore. He was listening to the small echo of love in Lily's request. Perhaps the old recipes weren't dead after all, not if they lived in a child's longing. That night, after the children left, Henry washed the dishes alone. The clatter of plates against porcelain sounded louder without conversation to soften it. He dried his hands on Maggie's apron and stood for a long time in the empty kitchen. His eyes settled on the top shelf, where a leather folder sat gathering dust. Inside were years' worth of receipts, grocery bills, utility payments, every quiet dollar he had spent to keep the family fed. His children thought the meals were free, that food appeared by magic, conjured from outdated recipes. They did not see the cost, financial, emotional, spiritual. Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. For 60 years he had spoken through food, but perhaps this time he would let paper speak. The following Sunday, the Parkers gathered again in Henry's home, as they had done for decades. But there was something different this time, something brittle in the air, as if a thread that once bound them tightly had begun to fray. Jason leaned over his phone while Rachel thumbed through a glossy catering brochure she had brought from the city. The smell of coffee filled the dining room, but the aroma of Henry's freshly baked rolls, cooling on the counter, seemed to go unnoticed. Jason slid the brochure across the table toward his sister. "Look at this spread. They'll do turkey glazed with pomegranate, sides of quinoa salad, little artisanal desserts. It's fresh. It's modern. It's what people expect now." Rachel hesitated, eyes darting toward her father. Her voice lowered as though she feared hurting him, yet still she said, "Maybe it's time, Dad. You've worked hard enough all these years. You don't need to worry about cooking for the holidays anymore. Let us take care of it." Her words were framed as kindness, but Henry heard the quiet strike underneath. "You don't belong in the kitchen anymore." He folded his hands in his lap, rough fingers interlaced. "If that's what you prefer," he said gently, his voice betraying none of the sting that pierced his chest. Jason clapped his hands together, sealing the decision. "Great. Finally, we can enjoy a meal without the whole meat and potatoes routine. It'll impress the family. The word finally lodged in Henry's chest. It was as though the years of meals he and Maggie had crafted with love were not cherished, but endured, mere placeholders until something shinier, trendier came along. Henry forced a smile, his lips thin and fragile. He glanced toward the kitchen where the rolls still waited, steam curling from their golden crusts. They had been his offering, his small reminder of tradition. Now they seemed to sit there like relics already forgotten. Lily reached for one quietly, tearing off a piece and dipping it in her milk. "Grandpa's rolls are still the best," she whispered, almost like a secret she didn't want the grown-ups to hear. Her words were balm, but too soft to heal the cut. Henry's mind wandered as Jason droned on about menus and Rachel nodded, trying to appear supportive. He thought back to a different table years earlier, when Maggie would set down a steaming casserole and the children would dive in with laughter and hunger. Back then, they never asked for catering. Back then, food was not about appearances, it was about family. Now the children talked of pomegranate glaze and quinoa as if love could be measured in novelty rather than nourishment. He pressed his palms against his knees under the table, grounding himself in silence. It was a habit he had perfected over time, to absorb the hurt without lashing back, to carry the weight alone. But the silence was different tonight. It wasn't the silence of patience. It was the silence of being erased. Later, when the coffee cups were empty and the brochures neatly stacked, Jason stood to leave. "We'll handle everything this year, Dad. Don't worry about a thing. Just sit back and enjoy it. You've earned the right to rest." There it was again, that polite dismissal disguised as kindness. Rachel kissed his cheek, her touch tender but hurried. "It'll be good for you, Dad. Less stress." Henry nodded, though his chest felt hollow. He walked them to the door, watched as their cars disappeared into the drizzle, and then turned back into the house that suddenly felt too quiet. The rolls still sat on the counter. He picked one up, tore it in half, and set the pieces on a plate. Eating alone had become a ritual since Maggie passed, but tonight the bite was hard to swallow. He looked toward the pantry door where her apron still hung and whispered, "They don't see you anymore, Maggie. They don't see us." The kitchen answered only with the ticking of the clock and the faint patter of Seattle rain. Henry carried the plate to the sink, rinsing it clean though he had barely touched the food. He lingered by the counter, his eyes settling on the corner where a faded shoebox sat tucked away. It held years of folded receipts, quietly stacked one atop another, each one a silent testimony. The price of flour, the cost of meat, the bill for the gas that heated the oven. No one had ever asked to see them. Why would they? Meals were magic in his children's eyes, conjured from love or perhaps now dismissed as outdated spells. But Henry knew better. He knew every dollar, every hour, every choice behind those meals. And though he did not say it aloud, a thought began to simmer in him like soup on a low flame. Maybe it's time they saw the cost. The next morning, when the house was empty, Henry sat at the table with a cup of black coffee. He opened the shoebox and began spreading the receipts across the table like cards in a game no one else wanted to play. Grocery bills from the old supermarket downtown. Utility statements from winters when gas prices soared, but he kept the oven running to bake bread anyway. Handwritten notes from Maggie. "Don't forget sugar for the pie, Henry," tucked among the slips. They were not just numbers. They were proof of a life lived in sacrifice, a record of love disguised as ordinary transactions. His fingers lingered over one slip in particular, dated from the year, Jason broke his arm and hospital bills nearly sank them. He had still bought the ingredients for meatloaf that week, scraping together enough so that his boy would come home to a warm plate. Outdated, they called it. He closed his eyes, pressing the receipt flat against the table as if to anchor himself. He didn't know it yet, but the folder of receipts would become his voice, the language his children could no longer ignore. For now, though, he simply gathered them into a neat stack, placed them back into the folder, and slid it onto the shelf. The storm was not yet here, but Henry Parker was preparing quietly for the day when silence would no longer suffice. The following week brought no visitors. The Parker house stood still against the gray skies, its windows clouded with condensation, its porch steps slick from the endless Seattle drizzle. Inside, Henry Parker kept to his routines. Mornings were always the same: black coffee in a chipped mug, the newspaper folded but rarely read, the faint creak of the kitchen floorboards as he moved from counter to sink. He didn't need an alarm anymore. The rhythm of his body and the loneliness of the house woke him early enough. But something had shifted in him since that Sunday. Where once his silence was simple acceptance, now it carried a new edge, like a blade being sharpened in secret. He began opening the leather folder more often. At night, after the lights were dimmed, he would spread the receipts across the table, lining them up in order, tracing his own history through dates and dollar amounts. Each slip was a breadcrumb trail back through time. A grocery bill from 1999, the week Jason left for college, when Maggie insisted they pack him homemade cookies so he would taste home in the dormitory. A utility bill from 2003. The winter the furnace nearly gave out, but Henry still kept the oven running for Rachel's birthday cake. A receipt from the farmer's market in 2010. Maggie's last summer, when she was too weak to walk but begged for fresh peaches. Henry had carried them home in both arms, tears mixing with rain as he walked. The receipts were not just proof of purchase. They were proof of devotion. Sometimes, as he sorted, Henry would hear Maggie's voice in his head. She had a way of speaking that made even ordinary words sound like prayers. "Henry, food is memory," she used to say. "Every bite holds a story. That's why we cook for family, not just to fill their stomachs, but to remind them of where they belong." He could still see her flour-dusted smile, hear the click of her wedding band against the mixing bowl as she stirred. When she died, Henry swore he would carry that truth forward. He thought his children understood it too. But now, faced with their laughter and dismissal, he wondered if they had ever truly heard her. One evening, Henry stood at the stove with the cast-iron skillet heating slowly. He cracked 2 eggs, whisked them with a pinch of salt, and poured them into the pan. The scent of butter filled the kitchen, rich and simple. He cooked not for anyone else, but for himself. And as he plated the omelet, he realized how rare that had been, feeding himself not as a necessity, but as an act of dignity. For decades, every meal had been about someone else. Jason's appetite, Rachel's preferences, Maggie's health, the neighbors who stopped by. He had become invisible in his own kitchen, a servant of love whose name never made it to the recipe. But now, eating alone, he tasted something new. Not bitterness, not anger, something quieter, a resolve. In the stillness, Henry began to prepare not just meals, but himself. He polished the silverware Maggie had cherished, set aside the china plates they had only used for holidays, and cleaned the dining room table until it gleamed. It wasn't for Jason or Rachel. It wasn't for any catered feast. It was for the day he knew was coming, the day he would no longer sit quietly in the corner. He rehearsed the moment in his mind, The children gathered, their voices dismissive, their eyes on their phones or on each other. And then he would lay the receipts on the table, one after another, like ingredients for a dish they had never tasted, the recipe of his sacrifice. The thought steadied him. It gave him purpose again. Yet even in this preparation, Henry remained gentle. When Rachel called midweek to ask about Lily's piano recital, he answered warmly, never betraying the storm that brewed within him. When Jason sent a message about catering costs, Henry replied with a thumbs up, his silence hiding the weight of what he held in his folder. Outwardly, he was the same old father, quiet, agreeable, benign. But inwardly, the receipts whispered to him, reminding him that love unacknowledged can harden into something else, the need for truth. One night, Henry took Maggie's apron from its hook. He pressed it to his face, breathing in the faint, fading trace of cinnamon. For a moment he felt her beside him, her hand on his arm, her voice calm and steady. "Henry, don't be cruel, but don't let them forget either. They need to remember." He nodded into the silence as if answering her. He wasn't preparing for vengeance. He was preparing for memory, for justice, quiet and undeniable. The receipts went back into the folder onto the shelf. His hands lingered on the cover before pulling away. The kitchen lights flicked off. The house dimmed. But in Henry Parker's heart, something had begun to glow, not anger, not revenge, but the steady fire of a man ready to speak at last. Thanksgiving arrived under a gray Seattle sky, the kind of heavy clouds that seemed to press down on the rooftops and seep into the bones. Inside the Parker house, however, the dining room bustled with voices and the rustle of coats being hung by the door. Jason arrived first, carrying boxes of catered dishes stacked neatly in foil trays. His tone was brisk, his movements efficient, as if he were orchestrating a business deal rather than a family holiday. "Careful with that," he muttered to Rachel as she helped him set the boxes on the counter. "The desserts cost extra. Don't smudge them." Rachel bit her lip, nodding, though her eyes drifted to her father. Henry stood at the kitchen doorway, dish towel draped over his shoulder, watching quietly as his children unpacked someone else's food in the space that had been his temple for decades. The smell of rosemary and citrus wafted from the trays, pleasant, polished, but impersonal. It was the smell of strangers' hands, not Maggie's, not his. Jason noticed his father lingering. "Dad," he said firmly, "you don't need to do anything today. Just sit back and relax. Let us handle this." The words landed like stones. Sit back, relax, for Henry. They didn't sound like kindness. They sounded like exile. He nodded slowly, retreating from the counter, the dish towel still in his hands. His place. The stove, the chopping board, the oven had been stripped from him with a smile and a shrug. The guests began to arrive. Neighbors, a cousin or two, even Pastor Thomas, who stopped by with a blessing before heading to another gathering. They crowded around the dining table, admiring the spread. "This looks wonderful," someone said. "Such a modern menu," another praised. "Who did the catering?" Jason beamed, naming the trendy downtown company as though it were a badge of progress. Rachel offered plates and napkins, bustling to make sure everything looked perfect. Henry sat in the corner armchair, the dish towel folded in his lap. He watched as the trays were opened, as serving spoons clattered against aluminum, as praise flowed freely toward dishes that carried no memory, no story. No one asked about his rolls cooling on the counter. No one noticed the skillet he had quietly seasoned out of habit that morning. For years his food had filled this room with laughter. Now he was invisible. Lily slipped away from the table, a roll tucked in her hand. She padded over to him, curling into his lap. "Grandpa," she whispered, "yours taste better." He smiled faintly, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Thank you, sweetheart." His voice was steady, but inside the ache deepened. If only a child could see what the grown children could not. Across the room, Jason raised his glass. To moving forward, he declared, to new traditions. The family echoed him, lifting glasses high. Rachel hesitated before clinking hers against his, glancing once more at her father. Henry lifted nothing. His hands remained on Lily's shoulders, steady as stone. The chatter rose around him, praise for the catering, jokes about outdated recipes, compliments traded back and forth. No one noticed the silence of the man in the corner. No one asked for his blessing as Maggie once had insisted they do. "Just sit and watch," Jason had said. And so he did, eyes tracing the faces at the table, ears registering every word. Each comment etched itself into him, not as bitterness but as record. It was not anger that filled him, it was clarity. The kind that comes when you realize you've been erased from your own story. The meal ended with applause for the caterers, with leftovers packed into plastic containers. Guests left with smiles, thanking Jason and Rachel for hosting such a fresh, impressive dinner. Henry stayed seated until the house emptied. The dish towel was still in his lap, now creased and damp where his hands had clenched it. When silence finally returned, he rose slowly, walked to the counter and picked up the untouched plate of rolls. He carried them back to the table, set them down and whispered into the empty room, "For you, Maggie, for what they've forgotten." Then, with deliberate care, he reached for the leather folder on the shelf. The time for silence was ending. The next chapter of his life and theirs would not be cooked in the kitchen. It would be written on paper. The morning after the holiday dinner, the Parker house was still heavy with the scent of rosemary and citrus. Leftovers sealed in containers stacked neatly in the fridge. But to Henry, the smell was hollow, like perfume without a pulse. He stood by the refrigerator door, hand resting on the handle, and realized he hadn't eaten a single bite of the catered meal. Instead, he reached for one of his rolls, now hard with age, and broke it in half. The crust crumbled, the inside still soft enough to chew. He ate it slowly, staring out the kitchen window at the drizzle that never seemed to end in Seattle. In his silence, the memory of last night replayed again and again. Jason raising his glass to new traditions, Rachel's uneasy smile, the laughter that washed over the catered dishes while his own bread cooled untouched. He felt no rage. Rage was too hot, too brief. What he felt was colder, steadier. The recognition that his love, measured in meals, had been erased. And so Henry decided it was time to show them what they had forgotten. He went to the pantry, pulling down the faded shoebox from the top shelf. Inside lay years of folded papers, neatly stacked, rubber-banded into bundles that sagged with age. Grocery store receipts, utility bills, handwritten notes Maggie had left him. Don't forget milk, buy apples for the pie, extra sugar, Jason's sweet tooth. He carried the box to the table and began laying the slips out one by one, the way a fisherman lays out his nets. Each paper told a story, though his children had never bothered to read it. There was the grocery slip from 1988, the year Rachel was born. Henry had bought flour, eggs, butter, and a bag of coffee to keep Maggie awake during long nights with the baby. There was the electricity bill from 1994, when Jason's little league team came over after practice and emptied the pantry in one sitting. Henry had smiled, paying the bill without complaint, proud that his house was full of boys with muddy cleats and hungry stomachs. There was the gas bill from 2010, when Maggie's illness had already begun to weaken her. He had cranked the oven every evening to bake the only food she could still taste, soft rolls, brushed with melted butter. Line by line, dollar by dollar, the papers formed a hidden ledger of sacrifice. His children remembered the meals. They did not remember the cost. Henry spread the receipts across the table, running his fingers over the faded ink. Some slips were smudged, others torn at the edges, but together they formed an unbroken record. 30 years of proof that love had a price tag and he had paid it. He picked up a bundle, flipping through quickly. The totals varied: $23, $15.47, $80, $112, 09. Modest amounts, some might say, but they had added up year after year until the sum could not be ignored. It wasn't the money itself that mattered. It was what those numbers represented. Nights when he had gone without new shoes so the pantry could stay full. Weekends he had worked overtime at the marina so Rachel's birthday cake could be frosted with strawberries. Mornings he had stood in line at the butcher shop, choosing cheaper cuts of meat but seasoning them with Maggie's recipes until no one noticed the difference. The children had laughed at meatloaf. They had forgotten that meatloaf was survival disguised as tradition. Henry paused, closing his eyes. He could hear Maggie's voice again, warm and steady. "Henry, you don't need to prove yourself. Love is enough." But love, he knew now, could be taken for granted. Love alone could be dismissed as outdated. And so he whispered into the quiet kitchen, "Forgive me, Maggie, but they need to see it." He stacked the receipts carefully into the leather folder, one pile after another until the folder bulged at the seams. Then he wrote a note on a sheet of plain paper. His pen moved slowly, deliberately, the words simple but heavy. "This is what every meal cost. This is what kept you fed. This is what kept you warm." He slipped the note into the front pocket of the folder and closed it. His hands rested on the worn cover for a long moment, as though sealing not just papers, but a lifetime of unspoken truth. That evening, Henry placed the folder on the dining table and sat across from it, as though testing the weight of what he would one day present. The folder seemed small, almost unremarkable, but to him it was a ledger of invisible love, a history his children could not deny once it was laid bare. Outside, the rain tapped harder on the window, like an insistent hand at the glass. Henry sipped his coffee and stared at the folder. He imagined Jason's smirk faltering, Rachel's uneasy eyes widening, Lily's small hands reaching across the table. He did not smile at the thought. He did not gloat. He only sat there, steady and calm, as a man who had carried a truth too long and was preparing finally to place it where it belonged. The receipts were ready. He was ready. The next gathering would not be like the last. The next family gathering came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of Sunday when drizzle streaked the windows and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. The Parker house looked as it always had, brick walls softened by ivy, smoke curling gently from the chimney, but something inside had shifted. Jason and Rachel arrived with their usual chatter, arms full of bags. Jason carried 2 more trays of catered food, proud of the arrangement he had negotiated with his downtown vendor. Rachel fussed over napkins and table settings, her voice bright, almost forced. Lily trailed behind them, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her gaze darting toward her grandfather in the kitchen doorway. Henry stood there quietly, his flannel shirt buttoned to the collar, his posture steady. On the table beside him sat the leather folder. "Dad," Jason said briskly, setting the trays on the counter, "we've got everything handled again. You just sit back and enjoy." Rachel added, "Yes, Dad, please. No work for you today." Her smile was polite, but her eyes flickered uncertainly toward the folder in his hand. Henry nodded once, not answering right away. He waited until the table was set, until everyone was seated, until the chatter filled the room the way steam fills a kitchen. He let them laugh, let them talk, let them boast about how much easier things were now. Then, without a word, he rose from his chair. The room fell quiet as he walked to the head of the table. His steps were slow, deliberate. He carried the folder as though it were a sacred book. He placed it on the tablecloth, its worn leather standing out among the polished silverware and catered dishes. "What's that?" Jason asked, frowning. Henry looked at his children, then at his granddaughter. His voice was steady, not raised, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "For years," he began, "you've eaten at this table. You've called the food old-fashioned, outdated, but every meal you had was built on this." He opened the folder and began spreading the receipts across the table. One by one, the slips of paper fluttered out. Yellowed grocery bills, folded electricity statements, crinkled notes Maggie had written. The table that had once held turkey and stuffing now filled with paper, a feast of memory and sacrifice. Jason leaned forward, incredulous. "Dad, what is this?" "These," Henry said softly, "are the costs you never saw, the flour that became your bread, the gas that baked your birthday cakes, the meatloaf you laughed at, it fed you when we had nothing else. Every dollar I spent, every hour I worked, every meal Maggie and I put on this table, it's all here." His fingers rested on the faded ink. "Outdated, you said, but these outdated meals kept you alive." Silence settled over the room. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Jason shifted in his seat, defensive, but the receipt spoke louder than any protest he could muster. Henry reached for a note tucked in the folder and laid it in front of them. His handwriting, careful and deliberate, read, "This is what every meal cost. This is what kept you fed. This is what kept you warm." He pushed the paper forward, his gaze steady. "You thought meals appeared by magic," he said, "but every bite came with a price. I paid it gladly for love, but love doesn't mean being erased." Lily, small and quiet, reached across the table and touched one of the receipts with her finger. "Grandpa," she whispered, "I didn't know." Henry's face softened as he looked at her. "I know, sweetheart, you weren't supposed to. Children aren't meant to carry that weight, but grown children should remember." Rachel wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "Dad, we never meant." But Henry raised a hand gently. "You didn't have to mean it. The hurt came anyway." Jason's jaw tightened. "So what, Dad? You're keeping score. You're throwing receipts in our faces now." Henry's expression didn't waver. "I'm showing you what you've forgotten. This isn't a scorecard, it's a record of what fed you, of what built you, of love turned into bread and bills." The room was silent again, save for the patter of rain against the window. Henry gathered the papers into a neat stack once more, tucking them back into the folder. He didn't slam it shut, didn't dramatize. He simply closed it, the way one closes a book at the end of a long chapter. "From now on," he said quietly, "you will see meals differently, whether you choose to or not." Jason looked away, his bravado cracked. Rachel lowered her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Lily climbed into her grandfather's lap and wrapped her arms around his neck. Henry held her close, his weathered hand smoothing her hair. His gaze stayed fixed on the folder before him, a quiet declaration of truth laid bare. The confrontation was over. The next step would not be spoken but lived. And Henry already knew what he would do with his love and where he would send it next. The days after the confrontation passed in silence. Jason sent no messages. Rachel called only once, her voice thin and hesitant, asking if Henry was doing okay. He answered gently, "I'm fine, sweetheart," and nothing more. But in truth, Henry was not dwelling on the argument. He wasn't replaying Jason's defensiveness or Rachel's tears. He had lived long enough to know that hurt words, once spoken, echo on their own without him feeding them. Instead, Henry focused on what came next. The folder of receipts sat on his dining table, no longer just a private record of love but a testimony delivered. He had spoken his truth. Now he needed to decide what to do with the years of sacrifice that still stretched ahead of him. The pension checks, the modest monthly sums he quietly set aside to help the kids. He knew now they didn't want his meals. Perhaps then they didn't need his money either. That Sunday, Henry walked down the slick sidewalk of his neighborhood, the folder tucked under his arm, his flannel shirt buttoned against the chill. He passed the marina where he had worked extra shifts for decades, the diner long closed where Maggie once served pies to truckers, and finally stopped in front of the small brick church. The doors creaked as he stepped inside. The smell of wax and wood filled the air. Father Thomas looked up from arranging hymnals. "Henry, good to see you." Henry nodded, his steps slow but purposeful as he approached. "Father, I need your help. I've been thinking about Maggie, about the meals we made together, about the table we kept." The priest tilted his head, listening. "They've forgotten, Father, my kids. They don't see the cost, the care. But I don't want to spend what I have left trying to convince them anymore. I'd rather feed someone who's hungry enough to taste it." He laid the folder on the pew. "I want to set up something in her name. Maggie Parker's Table, a fund, a place where people who need a meal can find one with dignity." Father Thomas's eyes softened. "A community soup kitchen." Henry nodded. "Yes, with my pension, with what I was giving them each month. Let it go to those who will remember. Let it go to honor her." The following week, papers were signed with Mrs. Wilson, the neighbor who worked as a paralegal. She guided him through the details. A small trust, funds redirected monthly, the church overseeing distribution. Henry's hand trembled slightly as he wrote his name at the bottom of the page, but his heart was steady. He felt Maggie's presence in that moment, as though she were standing just over his shoulder, flour still dusting her apron, whispering, "This is the right recipe, Henry. This is love served warm." When Jason and Rachel came by the next weekend, they found their father already waiting at the dining table, the folder once more before him. Jason sighed. "Dad, about last time." Henry lifted a hand gently. "No need, I've made my decision." He slid a document across the table. Jason frowned, scanning it quickly. "What is this?" "It's where the money goes now," Henry said. His voice was calm, almost tender. "I've been helping you month after month, year after year with the little I had left. But from now on, that money will go to the soup kitchen down the street. Maggie's Table, it will feed people who need it in her memory." Rachel's eyes widened. "Dad, you don't mean?" "I do," Henry said simply. "You said my food was outdated, but to someone who hasn't eaten all day, tradition is not outdated, it's survival, it's love." Jason's face flushed. "So you're cutting us off after everything?" "After everything," Henry interrupted gently. "I am still feeding, just not here." The words landed like a final course, unexpected, undeniable. Jason fell silent, his protest swallowed. Rachel looked down at her hands, tears brimming again. Only Lily broke the stillness, her small voice rising with a question. "Grandpa, will you still make apple pie there?" Henry's face softened into a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. And this time everyone will taste it with respect." That night, Henry sat alone in his kitchen. The folder closed beside him. Outside, the rain eased into a mist, and for the first time in weeks he felt something lighter than hurt. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He had simply found a new table, one where love would be received, not dismissed. And in that quiet realization, Henry Parker knew that he had given his children one final lesson: respect the hands that fed you, because one day those hands may feed others instead. The grand opening of Maggie's table took place on a Saturday evening in the basement hall of the little brick church. It was nothing fancy: rows of long wooden tables, mismatched chairs, a kitchen that smelled faintly of onions and broth. But to Henry Parker, it was the most sacred dining room he had ever seen. Volunteers bustled in aprons, ladling soup into bowls, arranging loaves of bread, setting pitchers of water along the tables. The guests arrived quietly at first: single mothers with tired eyes, men with rough hands who had seen too many cold nights, children whose hunger made them shy. Soon the hall filled with voices, with laughter, with the music of spoons against bowls. At the front, a small wooden sign read, "Maggie Parker's Table, where every meal tells a story of love." Henry stood near the kitchen door, apron tied around his waist, sleeves rolled up. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home. He stirred the pot, tasted the broth, adjusted the seasoning just the way Maggie once taught him. The volunteers deferred to him, calling him Chef Henry, though he smiled and shook his head. He wasn't a chef. He was simply a man cooking for those who still knew how to be grateful. As the evening went on, Pastor Thomas asked Henry to say a few words. Henry wiped his hands on his apron and stepped to the front of the room. His voice was quiet, but the hall fell still. "My wife Maggie believed food was memory," he began. "She said every bite held a story. For years, I cooked for my children, hoping they'd taste not just the food, but the love behind it. Somewhere along the way, they forgot. That happens, I suppose. Life gets loud and love becomes invisible." He paused, eyes sweeping the room. "So now I cook for you, for anyone who needs a table, a meal, a reminder that they are seen. Maggie's table will always be here as long as I have strength to stand at the stove, because tradition is not outdated. It is the way we keep each other alive." The room broke into gentle applause, not the polite kind, but the kind that carries gratitude in every clap. Henry felt a warmth rise in his chest. For the first time since Maggie's passing, the kitchen felt whole again. Later, as the hall emptied and the last bowls were washed, Henry sat at one of the long tables with Lily, who had insisted on helping all evening. She licked sugar from her fingers. His apple pie had been the final dessert, gone in minutes. "Grandpa," she whispered, leaning against him, "Mom said you don't cook for us anymore, but you still cook, just here." Henry smiled, smoothing her hair. "Yes, sweetheart, sometimes love has to move where it's welcome, but it never runs out. It only changes its table." Lily thought for a moment, then grinned. "Then this is our new table." Henry kissed her forehead, his eyes moist. "Yes, it is." The rain had stopped by the time they left the church. The night air was cool, fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant pine. Henry looked up at the sky, where the clouds had finally broken to reveal a sliver of stars. He thought of Maggie, and for the first time in a long time he didn't ache. He only whispered, "They'll remember now, my love." Not in the way we imagine, but in the way it was meant to be. And in that quiet moment, Henry Parker understood the full truth of his journey. Respect the hands that fed you. Tradition feeds the soul. Sparkles, thank you for watching this story on Family Shadows. If Henry's quiet strength touched you, please remember to subscribe so you never miss the next tale. From our family to yours, we wish you health, warmth, and happiness in your home and with your loved ones.